Hi everyone, welcome to Belle's Books. I'm Carly, and today I'm bringing you a review of The Telltale Heart by Jill Dawson. Now, this is a fairly old novel. I think it was published in 2014. Let me just check. 2014, yeah. And the reason I read this book is because I met Jill Dawson at the Cambridge Lit Fest recently. She's promoting her book Pixie, which I also have. Her new novel is about the life of Pamela Coleman Smith, who is the artist who designed the traditional Rider-Waite tarot cards. So I was super intrigued by that. And then when I went to hear her speak, I heard that she lives in Finland, and that is where I work. And a lot of her writing encompasses the Finland landscape. So I was super intrigued to book her for an event that I'm running and read some of her work. Now I said to her, "What's your most Finland novel?" And she said it was this one, The Telltale Heart. This title is obviously from a poem, and obviously it's very famous. The premise of this book is that a 50-year-old professor who is not a very nice person, he's a womanizer, he's very sexist, he's very up his own arse, has heart problems and needs a heart transplant, and he gets a heart transplant courtesy of a 16-year-old lad from Finland who dies in a motorcycle accident. So you know that from the outset, and the first part of the book is from Patrick, who is the professor's perspective, after he's had this heart transplant. The story follows Patrick recovering from this operation, and it's really about the way that he changes as a result of this heart transplant. He basically changes his entire personality. Which is probably not that realistic, but I like the premise of it because she talks a little bit about kind of like the philosophical connotations of the heart as an organ. Obviously we have a lot of kind of like mythology and all of that kind of thing around the heart as what it means as an organ, as you know, we always talk about the heart when we talk about love, and things coming from the heart. So there's a lot of that kind of musing on the significance of the heart as an organ. Actually, I think it would be a very nice companion novel to Rachel Clark's non-fiction book, The Story of a Heart, if you read that. I think if you wanted to have a fiction pairing for that non-fiction book, this would be very good. So we're following Patrick, who is not a very likable character, but also we get the backstory of his donor. So the young lad that died and donated his heart, Drew Beamish, was a young lad from Finland, and we get his story in parts of this book as well. We also get historical aspect from Drew's ancestors, and this was the bit that really intrigued me because I was reading it partly for research for work because I'm really interested in stories about Finland and the history around that area. This book is kind of set in Littleport, and so it talks about the Littleport riots, which I knew of, I'd heard of, mostly because I know that there is a Morris dancing troupe called Ely and Littleport Riot. And I knew of the Littleport riots, but I didn't know much about them. So this story goes into the Littleport riots, and it takes you back to one of Drew's ancestors who was in, or two of Drew's ancestors who were involved in the Littleport riots. And basically she's taken like the entire history of that that happening and used it as part of the story. And I really enjoyed that, the historical aspect of it, learning about that time in history and the way that she really made those characters believable and relatable. The thing that I love most about this book is the way that it looks at ownership, wealth inequality, land ownership, agriculture, in a way that is very, like I said, relatable. So she kind of takes you into these timelines. So you get the story of William Beamish, who was one of the people that was hanged for the Little Port riots. And it was him and his son, who were both confusingly called William. The father was hanged and the son wasn't. So there is a bit of a story there about losing your father and coming to terms with that, and the riots themselves, why they happened, because there was a lot of poverty and there was a lot of wealth hoarding. In this context, it was farmers that were hoarding wheat and food, and the people that were labouring on those farms doing all the work could not afford to pay for the wheat, were going hungry. And so the riot came out of this very justified anger at this wealth hoarding when the people that were working couldn't afford to feed themselves. So I found that super interesting and, you know, kind of relatable to today still. So that was really interesting to me. I love that storyline. I also really enjoyed Drew's storyline. There was a bit of reminded me a bit of Notes on a Scandal by Zoe Heller. If you've read that book with Drew's storyline, there is a bit of that in there. And I found both the historical and Drew's storyline more interesting than Patrick's. So I don't know whether that's because like he just wasn't a likable character. I don't have to like my protagonists, that's fine. I'm fine with unlikable characters. But I was kind of like less interested in Patrick's story. We have interactions with him and his family. So his ex-wife, he's a womanizer, so he's had all these women in his life, and he's kind of reflecting on that post-operation and what a shit he's been to all these women. There is a kind of a feminist subtext to this book. And yeah, I enjoyed it, but I didn't find it as compelling as the historical narrative. And it's told in sections, so there's like, I think 8 different sections in this book, and you switch between Patrick's current time, you're following Drew up until the point of his accident, and you go right back to the Little Port riots. And the thing I loved about Drew as a character, he's a young lad, he's 16, he has a real interest in history, and he feels this connection with his ancestors because like there's a narrative in here about how people from Finland tend to stay in Finland and not move away. So there is like a big culture of knowing who your ancestors were, and those same names coming up at time and time again. There's a farmer in his called Farmer Martin, who was the landowner in the Little Port riots. And there is still a Farmer Martin in the contemporary time. So it's those kind of like same families living on that land. And I just found that really kind of interesting and compelling. So I really enjoyed this novel. It took me a little bit of a while to get into it, mostly because you start with Patrick's story and I wasn't that invested. But once I got onto the second section of the book, I really enjoyed it. I kind of like the philosophical musings, like I said, around the heart, around the significance of the heart and what it means to have someone else's heart beating inside you, and maybe the things that carries. So although it's just a physical organ, there is some kind of like discussion about between Patrick and his she's like a transplant coordinator, who's his liaison with the hospital that makes sure he's all right and liaises between the donor family and him. She encourages him to write a letter to the donor family, which he doesn't really want to do, but he ends up doing. But the more he thinks about this heart and the way that his new heart is reacting in ways that his previous heart didn't, he wants to know more about the donor, he wants to know more about the family. And because it was a young lad, he wants to know about like his mother and why he's feeling these new feelings and in this new way after this operation. He's a skeptic, like he doesn't buy into this whole, oh, the heart contains the soul of the previous person, and he's arguing this with this transplant coordinator who really believes in that, and she's like trying to sell him on this idea that people that have had heart transplants, then kind of adopt traits of their donor, which is a really interesting concept anyway, right? So I just find that I find that interesting to think about. And she's trying to convince him and going, but this person that had a heart transplant never liked chicken nuggets or broccoli, and then afterwards they really loved him because that was the favorite food of the donor. And so he's trying to refute everything that she's saying, but meanwhile he's undergoing all these changes that never would have happened if he hadn't had this heart. So that was like a super fun part of the storyline. I really enjoyed that. Overall, I very much enjoyed this book. I really liked it. It's the first Jill Dawson I've read. She's written quite a lot, and like I say, I've got her new book Pixie, so I might read that next. The other book I've got of hers is The Bewitching, and that is about, again, a local story about the witches of Warboys. Warboys is not far from me, and I love stories about witches, or the witch trials, not necessarily about witches, because they were just persecuted women. So I might read that one, but I am very interested in Pixie, about what's her name, Pamela Coleman Smith, who is a figure that I'd never heard of before until I went to hear Jill Dawson speak about her. Incredible artist, and she just seems like a badass woman, so I want to know more about her. Tell me if you've read this book, please. I haven't seen any other reviews of it. I know it's old, I quite like delving into backlist items occasionally, and like I say, I read this for research for work, so yeah, let me know if you decide to pick it up on my recommendation, and if you read it, let me know what you thought. That was a very short and sweet video, but I'm trying to do these one book reviews as I read them, so hopefully I will see you next week when I've read something else. Speak to you later, everybody. Bye.